Hey. All right. How's it going? Can everybody hear me? All right. Okay. So how's it going, everybody? Actually, give me 1 second. Let me just make sure the volume on this is good. All right. So my name is Christian. My name is Christian Awesome, and I'm here on behalf of Salon Republic for Evo. And today, I'm going to spend about an hour and a half with everybody, just kind of going over, just a little bit of texture and kind of working with curly hair and some things that have really worked out, well for me. So um, basically, what I got is two really awesome haircuts lined up. We're going to start with just like this really awesome sort of shattered, kind of textured approach to, wavy hair, curly hair. And then we're going to get into a much shorter, sort of like bowl cut type of a length with a lot of texture and some razor thrown into it. And throughout, I'm really just going to work on how to incorporate or how I like to incorporate Evo products into what I'm doing, just to kind of create a little bit more of like a texture and a movement. I've been in the industry for about 16 years, and education is something that I like to do because I like to hang out with other hairdressers and just sort of troubleshoot, different ways in which we can be successful behind the chair. But what I do full time is I work behind the chair. I'm a full time hairdresser, and so I'm really, just like you guys in that, I'm kind of working behind the chair with real people and real problems and just sort of troubleshooting a lot of that sort of thing. So. Basically, like I said, we got about an hour and a half. We're gonna, get into two different haircuts. So, without further ado, let me just sort of adjust the camera really quick, and I'll get right into it. All right. Awesome. All right. So, if anybody has any questions, what I really want to do is just sort of direct any questions to the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get all this stuff out of the way, and then we can go ahead and get started. All right. So, basically, what I'm going to do is, the first look, which comes from our collection, most recent collection, is basically a haircut that's meant to sort of bring a little bit more movement to wavy and curly hair. And so what it's going to consist of really is just sort of establishing a foundation right in the back, a bit of a graduation so that we can give a little bit more lift and sort of like volume and movement to the hair that lives throughout the top. And so what I'm really going to go ahead and jump into is this really cool sort of bob shaped haircut that you can customize, give a little bit more length and movement and direction into the front. You can customize it with a little bit of a fringe, but the goal here is really to try to get as much volume across the top as possible. So, I'm going to get into really just a little bit of establishing a length and popping in some graduation throughout the back, and that's really going to serve as kind of the foundation to everything else. So, before I go ahead and start get cutted, what I want to do is really just kind of jump into just kind of like product prep and what I like to use when I'm working with, curly texture or wavier texture. So, typically I like to start with a little bit of product into the hair, really just to kind of work something into it, to kind of help serve as a cutting aid while I'm sort of combing through hair, but also just to kind of like have that conversation about what I'm using a little bit sooner throughout the service. That way it feels a little bit more organic and a bit more natural when I'm making my final recommendations towards the end. So first, what I'm going to prep with is just a little bit of head mistress, and it's a cuticle sealer. So its job is really just to deliver, a quick amount of moisture into the hair as soon as possible. I'm from Chicago, and so the air is just a little bit more, it's just a bit drier here. There's not as much humidity, especially in the wintertime. So I get a lot of, challenges a lot of times with my clients coming in and their hair just feels dry and the curl's not as defined and full as they want it to be. So I'm going to put a little bit of head mistress in here. And so, I think that, pretty healthy amount, I think, based off of the length that you're working with. should do pretty well. But I'm going to get that into the lengths here and just sort of make sure that I got a pretty good amount of coverage all throughout. And again, like I said, one of the reasons that I like to put product into the hair before I start with the haircut is as I start brushing and as I start combing through the hair, that's just helping to distribute a little bit more of that product throughout the lengths, so that I don't have to worry about it building up, too heavy in one spot or, not enough in another. So I'm going to work that into the hair, and then what I'm going to layer over the top of it is Total Recoil, which is a curl definer, and it's one of our newer products within our curl family. So I'm going to work some of that in there. And the thing that I love about Total Recoil is that it helps to give just a little bit more of a structure, of a foundation to your curl. When you're working it into your hands, I can tell you that it's definitely got a little bit of a tackier texture, which is perfect for when you want to just add a little bit more strength and definition to the curl as you're starting to work through it. So, a pretty good healthy amount is really what I'm going to work with. And again, like I said, I just want to make sure that I can get that, throughout the entirety of the hair. So really just kind of scrunching that through and kind of getting it into, the scalp. And just making it a little bit easier for when I actually start combing and brushing through the hair for me to get a pretty healthy distribution throughout. So again, like I said, started with Headmistress for moisture and then Total Recoil just for some definition throughout. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to work a little bit more of like a curly bobbed shape, and I want to create my foundation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate a section in the back from about the occipital to the mastoid process on both sides. And this underneath portion is going to serve as sort of the length and the foundation of this bob, but I'm also going to then build some graduation into it afterwards. So what I want this parting to look like is I want really to kind of just work down the center back. And I'm going from, about occipital, maybe high occipital, kind of somewhere within that range. And that's going to adjust based off of the density that I'm working with. If I got somebody with, a ton of density, then I can afford for that to be a little bit higher up, because more of that hair can safely be a part of the length and kind of the foundation. If I'm working with a bit of a lower density, like not a lot of hair, not super thick, then I want for that to be a little bit closer to the occipital or maybe even further down, so that I have more hair allotted to sort of the fullness and the layer that's going to live throughout the top of this. So, just for the head block that I'm working on, I'm going to go, about occipital there. And basically I'm just driving a line from the occipital to right behind the ear, okay? And, that's just going to go horizontally throughout that. So the rest of this hair, I'm basically just going to isolate, kind of keep clipped up out of my way. Another thing I want to talk about is really just like the choice in tools that I'm using. If I'm working with wavy and curly hair, and I'm working with it wet, because I don't always cut curly hair wet. In some instances, I will work this sort of a texture dry, but in this case, I'm working it wet because I'm building a foundation. So this is actually going to be a bit of a hybrid haircut, where I'm going to work the foundation wet just to kind of establish some strength in the perimeter. And then I'm going to diffuse dry throughout the top, and then we're going to shape up the rest of the haircut dry. So if I'm working with wavy or curlier texture and I'm working with it wet, basically I'm deciding based off of the type of curl pattern it is, the amount of stretch that I'm able to give it, because I really just want to be able to create as strong and solid of a foundation as I can. So the type of combs that I typically like to work with if I'm working with curly hair in a wet relationship is something with a lot of spacing, okay? So I don't really want to be working with combs that have too small of a teeth spacing, because it's going to put too much stretch and tension on a curl pattern, which could disrupt it too much, especially if I'm going to go in for a diffuser like a hand dry or an air dry a little bit later. So something that's got a pretty healthy tooth spacing. And then I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right, so the goal here is that I want to be able to create, a nice, strong, solid perimeter throughout the bottom. So, something just kind of cut straight across here is really what I'm going for. You can customize this too with like an angle of your finger if you want it to sit a little bit longer towards the front, but I'm going to go for something that maybe has got a slight angle forward. And then you want to choose a length, that's going to be best suited to, the type of layer and length that you want to, keep throughout the top afterwards. But, I'm going to shoot for maybe just a little bit past the jawline in the back. And then the length that I leave throughout the top can drape a little bit further and a little bit longer if I need it to. So let's go ahead and get started. So right now what I'm doing is, I'm going to be taking the entirety of the back in my perimeter section. And again, like I said, typically if I was working with, a straighter, more relaxed texture and I'm cutting a bob, I'm going to be a little bit more methodical about it in that context because, you've got the cleanliness and that sort of thing is something that you really want to take into consideration. But when I'm working with a curly and wavy texture, the idea is to use less tension because you want to be able to allow the formation and the speed at which the curl moves in to be able to do so freely, okay? So I'm not going to be working this, really tiny, skinny sections with lots of tension. I really want to kind of grab big sections and approach it in a little bit more of a sculptural context. So, big section here, and basically what I'm doing, I'm just going to use the wide teeth of my comb. I'm going to comb everything straight down, and then using my finger to sort of brace and hold this in place. So I'm not stretching on this a ton. I'm basically going to go in here with a point. And again, the idea is to create lots of loose movement and to allow curls to be able to do their thing freely, okay? So I'm not boxing this in with a lot of tension. I'm not boxing this in with, very, very clean lines. The idea is to be able to allow the hair some room to sort of move and to breathe when I start to work the texture back into it later. So all of this is just coming straight down. And when I'm finished with that, then I'm going to connect it into the sides here. So just past the jawline was what I was shooting for. So I'm going to angle this way here. And using my finger to sort of match up that guideline here. I'm just going to point into that. And so what I like to do is, you guys can see kind of the hand position that I'm using here. So when I'm pointing into my fingers this way, a lot of the times I like to use my bottom fingers here to sort of brace my still blade so that as I glide across, I'm just a little bit more aware of where the points of my scissors are at, or my shears are at, so that I don't cut into myself, all right? So just kind of like a little trick to sort of help give a little bit more control, all right? And then any stray or loose hairs I'm just going to get rid of. So I'm going to move on to the other side. We're going to do the same thing, all right? So this guideline right here is what I'm shooting for, right? So right there, connecting into the front. So I'm going to comb this down, and then there's my guide. I'm just going to drive that forward. All right, and so pointing this way is going to create a little bit of a peak and valley type of a situation in the perimeter here. And again, the purpose of that is just to allow the wave or the curl that I'm working with some room to sort of breathe and move around. And obviously, once this is completely dry, we can go in here and refine the cleanliness of that just a little bit more easily than we can when it's wet. But what I want to do then is just check my balance. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm about the same length on both sides. I overshot by a tiny little bit here, so I'm just going to adjust. Bam, okay? And then what I'll do is just check my balance. Okay, I'm pretty good. And that's what you're looking at here, okay? So you got a nice, pretty strong perimeter throughout the bottom. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to work a little bit of graduation into it, because at this point everything is just sitting one length, all right? And if you've got hair that's got some texture, some curly hair, some wavy hair, and it sits at one length, okay? Once the formation starts to come back in, all right, it's going to expand because all of the ends sit at the same point in space, right, throughout the perimeter. So if I'm not looking for an expansion here and I'm looking for more of an expansion up here, I want to then change this one length perimeter into a bit of a graduation, all right? And the benefit of that is that if I move the expansion from here into here, then it's going to create more of a support system for the layers that sit on top of that, which is going to equate to more volume throughout the top. So I'm going to go ahead and start to work a little bit of a graduation here. So I'm going to change my tools out. I'm going to work with a smaller shear. I'm still using a wide tooth spacing, and all of that combing and brushing through is just helping to distribute, the headmistress and the total recoil that I started with. It's helping to distribute it throughout the lengths of the hair so that I got a pretty good coating of everything when I start to get into the diffuse, all right? So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with vertical sections now, okay? Right in throughout this bottom area, all right? So vertical sections all the way till I get to the outside. And the goal is to be able to pull everything just kind of straight back. And the reason that I want to do that is because I want for the apex or the peak of that graduation to sit in the center back. And I want for the length throughout the front to stay as much as possible, because if I graduate too much into this area here, it's going to create a hole over the ear, and you don't want to create accidental holes in your haircuts, right? Like on purpose ones make a lot of sense if you are doing something a bit more creative, or you're trying to accentuate, changes in bone structure and facial features and things like that. But in this instance, we're really using this perimeter to sort of like to lend like a structure to the light, soft, sort of voluptuous layers that are going to live throughout the top. So I want to try to maintain as much length behind the ear as I can, so everything is going to get over directed backwards, so that the peak of this buildup sits in the center back, and it starts to slowly deplete and become a bit longer as it gets to the side. So I'm going to go ahead and move. And like I said, vertical sections right throughout the back. And I'm using kind of this wide toot spacing again because I don't want to create too much tension in the hair. I want to give my curls or my waves some room to breathe, all right? So when you pull this all out here, okay, what you should see is all of the ends, right, of the hair sort of, creating like this sort of build out shape here. And the reason why you see that is because at each sort of like point throughout the head shape, the hair has to travel a farther distance to meet that one length perimeter. So essentially, when you're choosing, where to start your graduation, what I like to think is that enough of the length should fall out, okay? And when you have the right amount of density in the perimeter fall out, then that's when you start your graduation. And then what you're going to do is that you're going to change and adjust your finger angle then to create the steepness, right, or the heaviness of the buildup that you're trying to create, the steepness or the heaviness of the graduation that you're trying to create to support the layer that's going to live throughout the top, all right? So I'm going to comb all this out, and basically what's happening here is that I'm pointing into the shape because, again, I want to create like a peak and a valley system that's going to just be a little bit more complementary to the type of texture that I'm working with, right? If I were working with straighter hair texture or like a slight wave to it, then a lot of the times I prioritize cleanliness. But when I'm working with hair that's got a bit more speed to it, then I like to prioritize flexibility into the haircut, right? So I'm pointing into everything, right? But the shape is still right there, okay? So then the next section I take, right, is going to be right next door to the first one, and I'm just going to isolate everything I'm not working on, and the goal is to move everything into the center here, right? So I'm taking my next section, pulling it all straight back. You'll be able to see your guide right through there, and again, I'm just going to point everything into the shape there. So again, like I said, the wide tooth spacing just allows for, a more controlled, looser tension. And as I start to get into the outsides, you're going to notice that less and less hair is able to overlap our guide here, which is exactly what we're shooting for. I want that by the time I get to the last section, that so little comes off that I'm blending into the side, but I'm also leaving the length here so I don't end up with an accidental hole there, all right? So now on this side, you can see that you've got just like a little bit more of a break where some of those hairs start to sort of like kick and flip and bend higher up throughout the shape. So I'll move to the other side and we'll do the same thing there. All right. So again, I'm going to take vertical sections all the way to the outside here. And I'm just pointing into my guide. Right on. Okay, and again, everything is going straight back. And as soon as I'm done with this last section here, what I'm going to do is check my balance on both sides because I want to make sure that I was consistently bringing both sides of the head back in equal amount. What I don't want to have happen is, to create a graduation throughout the back that's lopsided. You know what I mean? Where one side builds up a bit more than the other side, which can happen if I'm not bringing both sides back the same amount. Okay, and you might not think this is not the most visible part of the haircut, but still you want to put an equal amount of effort into both sides, because it could end up affecting how much volume one side gets versus the other. So what I want to do is I want to then take both the same spot on both sides of the head, bring it back, and just make sure they're about the same point in space. As long as I've got that symmetry, then I'm good to go. Okay. So from this point now, we've got a nice foundation established. Okay, I've got my perimeter and my length, and there's a little bit of give because I went through it with loose tension and I pointed into the shape. And then we got a bit of graduation, which is going to help to give some volume and some support to everything that I'm about to do throughout the top. Okay, and so what I like to do at this point is I like to move then into drying. Okay, so one thing that I really like to do behind the chair, especially if I'm kind of short on time, or I need to get to layering the top part in a short amount of time, is I like to combine working with a dryer and a diffuser at the same time. So if I'm sitting a dryer, like a hood dryer or like one of the oscillating dryers in the back part of the head, and then I can hand diffuse the front part of the head, then I like to usually do something like that because it cuts my dry time down just a little bit more. Now, obviously, everybody's a little bit different. If you've got the time to spare, then sometimes hand drying and diffusing something is the way to go. But what I wanted to show you is something that I like to use when I'm working behind the chair. So I've already got head mistress, which is great for moisture. I already got total recoil, which is going to help to create some structure and some stability, some definition to my curl. So if I'm working behind the chair, then a lot of the times I like to bring out the best of a person's curl. So my method is to go in with like a really deep scrunch kind of a thing. Okay, and if they don't have a consistent enough curl pattern, then I can get into like finger coiling or like pin curling and setting and clipping things together. I think that customizing this next part is super important to the type of person and the type of hair that's sitting in your chair. So what I'm giving you guys right now is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. You really kind of have to address each texture specifically to the variables that make it what it is, right? So typically, right, if I was working in this type of a situation, I a lot of times will ask my clients to just like look down. And that basically gets hair off of the scalp, okay? And the reason why that's so important is because typically when I see, people getting into working with curly texture, they're doing everything sort of free form, okay? And so you're getting a lot of, excuse me, movement and volume throughout the sides and the back, but then you don't get a whole ton of lift throughout the top. So I think just sort of like tilting somebody forward and, just sort of like, scrunching across the top, having them tilt their head back and scrunching throughout the back, and having it tilt throughout the side and kind of scrunching throughout the side. Just anything to get hair off of the scalp before you start to get into like shaping it is going to work wonders in terms of getting volume off the head. So I got a question here really fast from Bold Embrace Hair Studio. How's it going? What type of diffuser do you like the most? I'm thinking about getting diffusers shaped as a hand. Oh, actually, those are pretty dope. So the ones that you're talking about, the ones that are shaped like hands, are awesome because the fingers, right, of those diffusers get right into the scalp, and you can get a lot of really awesome lift right at the scalp, which you're sometimes not able to do when you're working with, say, like a sock diffuser or a diffuser attachment that sits on your blow dryer. So those diffusers are super awesome. I find that they're my favorite for getting into the scalp. But honestly, I like to have kind of like a collection of different types of diffusing methods, because like I said, every curl type and texture and like density, like the weight of the hair is going to be different per person. So I like to have that handy if I want to get some lift at the scalp. But then I might jump into like a sock diffuser if I'm floating on the outside. Just a second ago, one of the things that I talked about too was having like a hood dryer or an oscillating dryer for the back of the head, and then doing something more custom throughout the front of the head, just because it cuts down my dry time, in half if you can get a heat source coming from both sides. But I definitely recommend getting the hand diffusers because they're super awesome for getting tons of lift at the scalp. But thank you. Oh, my favorite shears. You know what? I think that's a hard question to answer. I would say that right now, what makes up most of my collection is Mizutani. I do have actually a couple of Mizutanis that I like to use, but I think more importantly than the brand of shear that I like to use, I like to just have a couple of different links. Like, I would say that if I had to narrow down my kit into two different, or you know, as few shears as possible, I would have a good texturizing shear, a good short shear, so something between like 4.5 to 6.5 inches, and then a good long shear, which is like, you know, 6 inches and above. Other than the brand, you know, I really like to just break it down into the size, because smaller shears are going to help me get into like closer graduation, more detail work. Longer shears are going to be better for like my scissor over combs and my layers. And then a good texturizer is always really good just for like getting rid of bulk and weight in a short amount of time. But yeah. Oh yeah, thank you. So yeah, have a collection of diffusers, and then when it comes to shears, like a good short one, a good long one, and then a good texturizer really are kind of like at the bulk of everything that I do. Oh, and I know it's not shear related, but I also like to have a good razor too. If I could travel with just those four, you know, tools for cutting, then I feel like pretty confidently set up for most situations that I walk into. So let's see. Let's see. Oh, okay. So do I find shears or razor cutting works best for texture? You know, I think that it depends on the type of texture. I think that, you know, for a long time, people were kind of nervous to use razors on curly hair, but I think that it really just depends on, number one, the amount of saturation in the hair, like how wet the hair is when you use it, or if you're going to use it in a dry hair situation, how sharp the razor is. So, you know, I've heard a lot of hairdressers in the past, they would say, you know, I change my razor out in between every haircut, and I remember sitting in classes like that and thinking to myself, like, man, I'm not going to do that. That gets really expensive. But when you really start to play with it a little bit more, and especially if you're raising on dry hair, like, it does make a lot of sense to change your razor out. And just different things like that. So I think for me, it really just depends on what I'm doing. Like, I am going to use a little bit of razor and scissor work when I'm working with this haircut, and I think that in most situations, a lot of the times I will default to using a little bit of both in every single haircut, because there's just certain like textures that shears give you when cutting hair, whether it's straight hair or curly hair, that razor can't, and then vice versa. So, you know, just being flexible when it comes to having, you know, like a preference, and you know, deciding when you're going to use it. But you know, for this, I created the perimeter and the graduation with a shear, and then for the top, I'm going to play around a little bit more with just a little bit of razor and maybe a little bit of scissor too. So once I get sort of like the set finished here, right? So I'm going through and I'm scrunching. I'm going to show you something that I like to use that is awesome for getting a ton of lift at the scalp. So basically, you can pick up something like this, okay, which you can get from like any beauty supply store. It's just like a standard like afro hair pick. These work great on seriously all types of curly textures when you want to get a ton of lift at the top. So basically what I like to do is, let's say I've got, you know, all the product that I got in my hair, right? I scrunched it, you know, I got as much lift out of it. If there were parts of the hair that didn't have a strong curl pattern, maybe I supplemented that curl pattern with like a twist, or, you know, like a finger coil or something like that. Let's say that I've got all that part out of the way, right? And I've got my texture looking how I want it, but I just want more lift at the top. Basically, I'll take two of these guys right here, okay? And one of them, basically I'm going to part the hair where my client parts. And one of them is going to go in the front, right in the middle of that part. So there's going to be some on either side of the part. And the other one's going to go in the back, still on the part. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to push them together, and I'm going to lock them in place, okay? Just like that, okay? So when you're done, they should lock in place. They should look something like this, okay? And it's important that you get a little bit of the hair pick on both sides of the part, because if you don't, then you're not going to get an equal amount of lift on both sides of the part, okay? So I take one pick, and it's going to go in the front, and it's going to go in, and I take the other pick, and it's going to go in the back, and it's going to go in, both on right centered on the part. I push them together until they just like hold in place, okay? And basically what's happening is like those two are pushed together, so it's creating lift at the scalp, right? And it's creating lift in a light enough way to where airflow is going to be able to pass underneath, okay? And that's going to help you to dry with a little bit more lift on the scalp. Now, if you're worried about too much like volume at the bangs, all you got to do is just put it slightly behind like a person's fringe or their bang, slightly behind it, and then repeat the process so that at the front hairline, that front hairline is still kind of flatter to the head, but everything behind it is then lifted. You can adjust it any way you want to, but working with two hair picks and sort of locking them in place helps again to create lift at the base. And then once you go through with your like diffuser, you go through with your your oscillating dryer, your hood dryer, whatever you're going to do, whatever diffusing method you're going to use, after the hair is completely dry, I let those bad boys out, and you just get so much lift at the scalp that it's like your clients just go absolutely crazy for it. Oh yeah. Yeah, you really should try it. Like it's seriously, it's been my favorite. Honestly, like I've tried so many different types of things to get a decent amount of lift at a person's scalp, and like I found that these by far are my favorite. Like I used to be the type of person that I would use like tiny little pin curl clips, and that works great. But just like the amount of time it takes versus just popping just two hair picks into the hair, it's like crazy. So I'm gonna do like a cooking show. I'm gonna pass this out really quick. I've already got a dry one right here. All right. So this is a dry one that I did right before class started, and basically once I get to that part, right, that I just showed you, then I'm going to go through with my diffuser or like my oscillating dryer or my hood dryer or whatever, and my method when I'm diffusing hair is once I've got everything set where I want it to go, I don't touch it until the hair is completely dry, okay? Now, no matter what type of products that you like to use, right? Like if you're like a gel and a hair cream type of person, or you're like a curl cream type of person, or whatever you use, I still won't touch the hair until it's completely dry. And how I know when it's completely dry is that it creates like a shell, okay? Like a crunchy type of a shell. And that's a good thing. Like I want that shell, because what that is it's like the salt bonds and the hydrogen bonds have formed back together, and they've created sort of like this shell and this structure around the hair. Now, once I get that sort of like hard texture, I know that I can beat the crap out of these curls, and the definition is not going to go away because those bonds have solidified in a way that makes like this one little curl just that one little curl, and that one little curl just that one little curl. Does that make sense? So when you get into like diffusing hair and you go by like creating shells and like that sort of kind of method, you can be a lot more heavy-handed with curly hair because you know that you're not going to like break it apart as much. And if you do, it's easy to sort of like mist like a curl definer back into it. Like a lot of the times, like I'll just mist like Dave Grace or something back into it, and it's not weighted enough to where it's going to break that texture back down again, but just to like defrizz and like bring a little bit more of a definition back into it. So yeah, actually you're absolutely right. Any beauty supply store is going to have these picks. I picked these up from like a Sally's Beauty Supply. I know hairdressers that just found them on Amazon. Like they're really easy to get. They're super inexpensive. Honestly, even if you want to try to figure out a place you can like find them wholesale and you can retail them in the salons or in the shops, like because once clients see this stuff, like, and they see how easy it is compared to just like other methods, it's really difficult to try to get them off of it. So I'm gonna pop these back out now, and you can see just at the base here the amount of lift that I got here, and at the back here the amount of lift that I got there. And so once I'm finished with that, basically I'm just gonna scrunch. I'm going to scrunch to sort of soften, okay? And so, because like I said, when it dries, with a bit of like a hard sort of crunchy texture to it. And so when I scrunch into it, I'm breaking apart that texture, okay? And I'm just creating a bit more of a softness. Now, this is honestly my favorite part of dressing out curly hair and hair with some texture. It's my favorite part because you see the hair go from like these really like like crispy, sort of dry, crunchy, to like the more that I touch it, the more that I beat it up, the softer and lighter and airier it gets, especially when you've got like a really good defining product, like Total Recoil in the hair, or sometimes I'll use like liquid rollers with some shape vixen in the hair. But the more you touch it, the bigger and the fluffier and the softer it's going to get, okay? And you guys can see evidence of that in here, right? It's starting to defy gravity just a little bit more. Now, if I want it to get even bigger, then all you got to use is something that's got some volumizing kind of properties to it. So a lot of the times I'll take like a root canal or a volumizing spray, something like this, just to kind of mist into the hair. And it's a spray, but it's not heavy. It's not like heavy enough to sort of like break the curl structure back down. It really just sort of like buries itself into the hair and then creates like a grittiness, okay? So that's basically what I'm doing here is I'm just working a little bit more kind of volume back into the hair. And if you're not completely dry, then it's really nothing to sort of like take a little diffuser and sort of get into the scalp here. So, the same hair picks that I use to sort of like, create the lift here, you can use a hair pick and just sort of lift that up. Or if you have that little finger diffuser, you can use that to lift that up and then just hit it with a little bit of airflow right on the inside, and then you can get to drying that a little bit better. So I'm going to do that for a second here. Here I've got more of like a sock diffuser type of a thing. All right, and so once I got just a little bit more of like a, like a drier, there we go. That's what I was looking for there. Now I'm gonna start to work the layer throughout the top of it. And the reason why I approach this haircut this way is because, curly hair is three-dimensional in a way that like straight hair or like, really soft wavy hair is not, right? Like, I feel like it's when you're working with a straighter texture or a wavier texture, it is influenced more by like gravity, right? Compared to hair that's got a bit of more of a wave or a texture to it, and it's still obviously is influenced by gravity, but it has the ability to sort of like build on top of itself in a way that straight hair or wavy hair is not able to. So if what I'm going for is like tons of lift and tons of volume up in this area here, I need to be able to see what the curl is doing so that I can decide as I start to move up the haircut, how am I going to take weight or length off in order to create more of a built-up shape throughout the top. And like dressing it is one part of it, right? So using the clips, using the right products and the picks and that sort of thing is one thing. The rest of it is then like each individual curl. How much does that curl weigh? And can it weigh less in a way that's going to help them then support the curls that sit on the top of it? So it takes a very sort of like sculptural approach to it, right? So I've got my graduation foundation down throughout the bottom, and that is, that's like building up. You can see that in the expanded shape here. It's building up to sort of help with some lift throughout here. So what I like to do now is just kind of take it curl by curl and just sort of build up the shape. And so here I'm not really using any kind of a comb here at this point, all right? And if I'm going to use clips of any kind, then I want to make sure that they're like for more dry hair, like something soft and gentle that's not going to rip out or pull out or like frizz out any type of a curl. But basically what I want to do past this point is I want to grab each individual little curl and I want to sort of like sculpt out the type of shape that I'm going for, okay? And so cutting hair this way just allows for you to kind of take a more sculptural approach in sort of shaping and defining the hair a little bit more. So basically what I'm doing is just like pulling everything with a really, really light tension and sort of just cutting into it. Now, when I cut into dry curly hair this way, I like to cut with my shears sort of facing out. like I don't want to cut anything super blunt because that's going to show then in like that individual little curl there's going to be just like this dead stop here, and it doesn't really like work the best, right? So what I want to do is I almost want to take and sort of like carve out into a point, or if you got a really sharp razor, use the really sharp razor to sort of build out into a point. That helps the ends of the curl to stay way, way, way softer and with less frizz, and just allows things to sort of build up a little bit more. So I'm taking everything and I'm just like lightly sort of, cutting out the shapes that I don't want to see in an effort to sort of bring a bit more lift into this top area here. So it really does take on a more sculptural sort of element. And honestly, this is one of my favorite parts about doing this haircut for our collection, was that the model that we cut on had the most beautiful, beautiful curl texture, and you really started to create and sort of defy gravity and sort of create something that like you could see kind of come into life. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Suggestions for oils or moisturizers for scalp and coil textured hair. I've seen people have like a little bit of success with. Man, I'm trying to think of it really fast. I can't think of the exact name of it. Oils, especially lighter weight oils, are really going to be super helpful. For like maintaining the moisture level. I find what oils do the best though is they're best for like protective long term, right? Because think about like what oil does for the hair is it helps to sort of like lock in moisture, right? And to sort of create like a protective barrier from just like I don't know, stuff like the elements, right? Like we're walking around outside and there's just like pollution and sort of like UVA and UVB rays and just like a lack of moisture, especially here in Chicago. There's like no moisture, or you know what I mean, it's like completely the humidity is gone during the winter time, so it like helps to act as a protective barrier for the hair in that instance. So like I'm definitely pro oil when it comes to protecting your hair and protecting your scalp, so long as there's like a proper cleansing method periodically here and there, because just as much as I love oils to protect the hair and the scalp, like too much of a good thing sometimes can be a bad thing. So as far as like specific, types of oil, I don't really have anything off the top of my head that I would recommend. But I really do also believe that, every single hair type and every single texture, like every person, really kind of needs a little bit more of like a customized look into what we recommend for them, as opposed to just like a one-size-fits-all type of a thing. What's good for one person might not always necessarily be the best for everybody. So I would say just kind of like experiment with each individual person, and maybe have like maybe like a collection of things on hand just in case. But let's see. Does the sock help prevent frizz? Oh, you know what? What the sock does is it basically just like how like diffusers, they've got all those tiny little holes throughout them. They're meant to sort of diffuse the airflow, but sometimes you can still feel like little pushes of air come out of just the very, very ends. The sock diffuser cuts out any air transfer, and it really just feels like a convection oven. You know what I mean? Like it feels like you're just standing under a hot heater, with no air transfer, as opposed to like how some diffusers can soften the air transfer, but there's still air transfer there. So it does help to dry with like a tiny, tiny little bit less frizz. I really just like to use it because it's just like, like it prevents too high of a heat sometimes from kind of getting through, which is sometimes important to me, more for like the comfort of the person sitting in my chair type of a purpose. But like I said, like it really just depends on what you're doing and the type and the texture of the curl that you're working on. I like the sock diffuser just because it's just a little bit different than like a conventional sort of diffuser, but I've got different types of diffusers too, so I don't always just use the sock one. It really just kind of depends. Sock breaks the airflow. Yeah, exactly. It breaks the airflow, so it's like it just feels like you're standing under a convection oven instead. So now that I'm getting into the side, I want to make sure that as I start to sort of sculpt this, that I drop the length down a little bit more, because remember, it is a little bit more of a bob. So I don't want to take too much length off of the front, but because the length is getting longer, you're going to get more of a flat shape here. So where I want to protect the length, the interior is then the stuff that I want to take off. So maybe this doesn't go, but like this stuff right here can definitely go. So I'm going to get into the inside here, and I'm going to start to work this stuff a little bit shorter, because the shorter it is, the less it weighs. And the less it weighs, the easier it is to get a more significant amount of volume out of it, okay? So you guys can see just in that spot there, length stayed the same, interior starting to build out a little bit more. And if I can build it out enough, then the layers that sit across the top will start to kick up just a little bit more. So this stuff right here, like that's also too long. So I'm gonna come in here and I'm just gonna break that apart a little bit more. And I find that, you know, again, cutting outwards into the hair is going to be better suited for like protecting against split ends and that sort of thing. It's not going to look as like harsh and like dead stop into the hair, and it's just going to sit a little bit nicer once you're finished. So again, like I said, you know, just taking a little bit more of a sculptural approach to it is really what I'm going for. And then once I get into the front, here, this right here, it just sits way too heavy for me right there, right? So here I might even start to lift this up, you know, much higher and get more of like a layered kind of approach out of it, and just kind of open up the front. You know, you can work a bit of a fringe into the shape if you want to, which always, in my opinion, helps curly and wavy hair with volume, especially throughout the front. You know, it's something that you got to pay attention to, because, you know, I think a lot of the times, you know, we're working from behind, looking into the mirror in the front, and so we're always looking at the silhouette of the shape on the sides, and we don't necessarily like step off to the side and look at the silhouette from the front to the back. So I mean, you can see this in the camera here, that right there is just too flat. So I want to be able to get a little bit more lift right there throughout the front, which is going to help. Okay, so I'm really just like working all of this up. And as long as you really kind of pay attention periodically to like where each strand of hair is coming from, then you kind of help to protect the length a little bit more too. Because at this point, you know, I really want to make sure that I get a good amount of lift throughout the interior, but I don't want to compromise in any kind of a way the overall length. You know, if that starts to happen, then with curly hair, it's just you got to be a lot more careful when you're working with the length and curly and wavy hair, because, you know, with straight hair and with like, you know, a very, very slight wave, length, like growing a person's hair out, it looks more obvious, right? Because there's less movement happening. So like when I'm working with curly hair, when I'm working with wavy hair, like I really have to be very cautious of the overall length, just because of how far back you can set a person by accidentally going too far with the length. Let's see. All right, so question in the front, would directing hair up or directing hair forward be the best in the front? Yeah, you know what? See, because I'm thinking right now of like, you know, you basically, you know, you want to pull hair, right, in the direction that you want the hair like opposite to move. You know what I mean? So like I'm going for a lot more lift in this area here. So if I pull it all back, the hair in the front's going to travel too far a distance, which is going to keep it too long. And if it's too long, you're not going to get any lift or volume out of it. So I want to pull it in the direction that I want for that weight to come off of, so that when I'm finished, the stuff here is just a little bit shorter and I get a little bit more lift. Like just in throughout that here, like creating that lift off there, this hair weighs less now, so I can get a ton more lift out of that front area. So, you know, I'm always thinking about, you know, where I want that lift to come out of, you know. Now, let's just say, for example, I wanted for, the length to stay long so that I can like part it over to a side. Then a lot of the times, like what I'm pulling forward is going to come more from the apex area, but regardless, it's going to come forward because that's the only way that I'm going to be able to get lift in this area. If this region or part of the haircut stays too long, you're just not going to get any like significant amount of length. You're going to have to rely solely on just how you dry it, which, you know, isn't a bad thing, but I don't know, like I think that I'm always trying to find a balance between what is going to structurally make sense for the haircut and what is going to, on a maintenance level, make most sense to the person who's wearing it. You know what I mean? And so I feel like a lot of haircutting, a lot of working with people, honestly, is just that, isn't it? It's like trying to find the balance between structurally what you think is best, right, as a professional, and like what's going to make the most sense for the person who then has to wear it for the next 6 weeks or the next 8 weeks or whatever. So in this instance, like, yeah, I would say pulling it forward is going to be the best method to sort of get weight off of the front part of it. And then, you know what I mean? Like you can obviously customize and sort of play around with it, you know, as you see fit past that point. But that's the direction that I would go with it. Let's see. With this hair texture, would you thin out spots, create more lift? Absolutely. If you have the density to support it, yes. You know, like, obviously these doll heads, they don't have a whole ton of density. Not the same kind of density as a real person. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm not talking about fine hair or coarse hair or medium hair. Like, I'm talking about the amount of individual hairs per square inch on a person's head, right? If they got a ton of density, even if it's fine, that's a green light for me. You know, like I can do so much with a lot of density. When you start to get into those lower amounts of density, like then that's where you got to try to get a little bit more creative. And so if I'm working with a low density and I want to get volume, a lot of the times I just rely on like teaching people how to set their hair, what type of products to use. Like those typically seems to be the better solutions when I'm working on lower densities. But when I'm working on higher densities, man, that's like a green light for me. Like I can do so much with someone that has a ton of hair, especially when it comes to like weight removal, because there's so much more to kind of play with. You know what I mean? I feel like you just have a lot more. You got a lot more to work with, you know, when you're working with people with a lot of density, and so you can try things that you really might not be able to get away with when you're working on lower densities. So, yeah, I would say definitely tons of weight removal, but when it comes to the technique of the weight removal, that is where I might sort of vary a little bit more. And what I mean by that is like, I would still kind of approach it how I'm approaching it now, right? Like with a scissor, each individual curl, or with a razor, each individual curl. What I probably wouldn't do is like hop in here with a texturizing scissor or anything that's gonna like pull out my curls or make them frizzy or break them apart or anything like that. So yes, I would definitely go in here and like play around with weight removal, but I would probably just sort of like limit the technique that I'm using. So I said earlier that I was going to get in here with a bit of a razor too, just to kind of show everybody what that would look like. Let's say maybe I want to pop in here and just carve out a little bit of weight on the interior. Here, you know, I would kind of work on, you know, a little bit of curl and sort of softening that there. So that might be like a weight removal technique that I would use. But here's one thing that I will say, that if you're going to use a razor on dry hair, you want to make sure that that razor is sharp. Because, you know, back in the day, I remember when, like, as a hairdresser, I would get into conversations with clients who would say things like, don't use a razor on my hair, razors don't work on my hair. The truth of the matter, the fact of the matter is that razors work on most any kind of a hair. It's that, like, they had a bad experience and it ruined it for everybody else. You know what I'm saying? And so I feel like a lot of the times bad experiences with razors comes from using the razor in the wrong situation. So the razor is dull, it's just shredding into the hair and creating a ton of split ends, or, you know, maybe the wrong type of tension was used, maybe it was like too big of a section, maybe just like, you know what I mean, like you were too heavy-handed with it and you weren't respecting the silhouette enough. Like there's a lot of reasons as to why a razor didn't work for somebody, but very, very seldom is it that the razor itself is not right for the texture of hair. It's usually more of a human error type of a thing as opposed to like a mechanical error. And so I would say that there's a lot of things that I would consider when using a razor on dry hair, but at the top of the list for me would be just that the razor is sharp, right? because if I'm not going to have any like water in the hair, if the hair's not going to be wet, or I'm not going to have like a cutting agent into the hair, which is also going to be wet. If there's no source of lubrication for the hair to, or for the razor to glide more easily through the hair, then the razor's just got to be sharp. It's got to be real sharp. Otherwise, you might end up with a bad type of a situation. Let's see. I've seen stylists remove slices of hair at the scalp. I've never gone that short, thinning out. Suggestions. What happens when this grows out? Oof. I'm not gonna lie and say that I haven't done that before, but I would say that if I'm gonna do something like that, it's gonna be in a very inconspicuous area. Like, it's not gonna be anywhere near a perimeter, meaning nowhere near a part, nowhere near a front hairline. It's gonna be interior only, and interior specifically in a spot that they're never gonna like, oh, I feel like doing a deep side part today. Like, it's gotta be like insides. So I have seen that done before. And again, in my opinion, there's ways that are less aggressive and there's ways that are more aggressive. I've seen some where, like, you come in and you take a section out and you come in and you just like cut it blunt. Like, if I was gonna take weight out at the scalp, I wouldn't cut anything blunt, right? Like, I would always sort of like cut at an angle or point into it, or like take a razor and just slightly carve out of it, only because that grow out is going to be way less conspicuous than something that's like more blunt, right? Like, imagine coming in here and I cut in here just real blunt like that. That's always going to grow out a line as it's growing out. So you're going to notice it if you're like looking for it, if you stumble upon it. If you come in here and you make it soft, right, all the way up at the scalp, it's going to grow out soft. And so it's not saying that you'll never find it or that a person will never see it. It's just like less, you know what I mean, like noticeable than working something blunt. So again, like I said, I'll admit I've done it before, and it's been in extreme situations. Like, I'm talking, I actually work with somebody who has just got the thickest hair, like out of any person, including my mom, including my sister combined. They got thick hair, right? Like, I'm talking like ponytail the size of your arm thick, right? And in that instance, where that causes more discomfort to a person than it is beneficial to them. And so in her case, right, like, we straight up just went in there right at the scalp, and she was a hairdresser, so she was down with it. But like, you go right up in there at the scalp and you take weight out right at the scalp, and like, that's going to be a ton of weight removal in a way that's going to last a long time too. Because if I'm taking out weight throughout the mid strands, right, it's only going to last for so long before all that density is replenished again, just due to hair growth. But if you take it all the way at the scalp, it's going to last a lot longer, and that those pieces are going to take a lot longer to get down to the perimeter. So in her case, right, it made a ton of sense. She was a hairdresser. She knew what was going on. Like, we were all down with it. If I'm doing it on a person, sometimes it takes a little bit more finessing and sort of like explaining to someone, like, physically what's happening to the hair, how's it's going to grow out, what it's going to look like. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of have to finesse it a little bit more and sort of gain that type of a trust. But I wouldn't say never. Like I said, I've done it before, and there's definitely times where you should do it and times where you probably absolutely should not do it. But you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's really just it's situational. You know, you gotta have to approach everything slightly different. So now that I got kind of the shape and the silhouette that I'm going for, right? Like, I'm super happy with the amount of lift that we're getting throughout the top here. Like, and especially if you're working with a much tighter sort of texture, like, this is just going to get rounder and rounder, all right? So what's important to me now is that I'm using, a product that's going to help to support sort of the weight of it, because one of the cool things about curly hair is that you can defy gravity with it, but one of the things that you got to be careful with is that, like, you want to make sure that definition lasts, a pretty good amount of time. So just a couple of like finishing products that I like to use are things like Shebang Bang is a really awesome dry spray wax. It's really good for just creating some definition, like piecing things apart a little bit more. It's totally brushable in the sense that it's not so heavy that it's going to affect like how much lift and volume you're going to get out of it, but it's going to piece things apart a little bit more. If you're working with a finer texture or a lower density, then I like to come in here with a little bit of haze, because what haze does is that haze is going to give me a little bit more volume into the hair. Basically, it's like a styling powder, right? So you can see here when that comes out, it comes out with just a little bit more of like a softer sort of a finish to it, and I think the pump delivery system allows you to kind of get into kind of the scalp and the base a little bit more. But this makes the hair like really pliable in a way that hairspray wouldn't. What I mean by that is, like, once you get it into the hair, it creates like a friction that allows the hair to sort of like move and shape and sort of mold in a way that like something like a hairspray or a texture spray wouldn't. So I like to work some of that into it. or honestly, if you want to save yourself even a little bit of time, you can spray something like haze directly into total recoil, right? Like after you work it into your hands, spray it directly into total recoil, and then you got more of like a, you know, a targeted sort of delivery system than if you were going to work in here dry. So, all right, so that's your finished look here, you know what I mean? And you can come in here and sort of like iron out the fringe just a little bit more if you needed to, but that's kind of like the shape overall. Right on. All right. So I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna step away for just a second and kind of grab my other doll head so that we can get into the next haircut, which is this really awesome kind of short bowl haircut, right? So let me get that all set up. I'll be right back. Okay, hold on a second. Let me answer this question really fast. All right, so far the only product I used was, okay, so first thing that I used was Headmistress, which was a cuticle sealer. So basically the whole point of this is just like, it doesn't have a whole lot of hold. It's solely for delivering moisture into the hair. And the reason why I use it, like I use it a lot this time of year because I'm in Chicago and like we're getting a blizzard right now. Like it's supposed to snow like 12 inches right now. And like there's so little humidity and moisture in the air right now that if you got curl or texture here in Chicago, you're having a terrible time. Like it's just not doing anything for you. It's so dry right now. Like your eyes are dry, your skin's dry, people got dandruff all over the place. So in the wintertime, I like to use stuff like delivers a quick amount of moisture that doesn't have a whole lot of hold and it's not going to affect the hold of anything else that I layer over the top of it. It's purely just for getting like moisture into the hair in a soft way. So I use that first, and then I use Total Recoil, which is like a cutting lotion. It's like a curl definer. So it's got a bit more of a tackiness to it. So I like to explain to people that like, if you like using gels with your lotions, you know what I mean? Because sometimes gels will dry a little bit faster and they add a little bit more of a crunch. Sometimes people use them because the gels, they dry faster and they create a tackiness. I like using this because of the tackiness aspect. Like it's similar to liquid rollers in that like liquid rollers is a curl balm, but this just has a little bit more of a sticky, like a tackiness to it in the wet phase, but when it dries, it like you scrunch it out and it finishes super, super soft. So I use that, and then lastly was just a little bit of haze. So in terms of like product choices, I'm really a big fan of using kind of like, you know, fewer type of things. Like I'll usually kind of cap myself at 3. Not that there's anything wrong with using more, and in some situations you have to use a little bit more, but I always try to think about like, if I'm the client and I'm sitting in the chair, how much time do I want to spend in my hair? And so like I try to make things as bite-sized as possible for people when it comes to like products that they're using in the hair. But I'm gonna step back because I just realized that you can't even see my eyes. I'm gonna go ahead and grab my other doll head, and then we're gonna get into our next haircut. But great questions so far. Thank you guys so much. I'll be right back. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our next haircut. Let's see. Oh yeah. The first 2 products, definitely, you really should. Let me just sort of show them real fast here. That way you can see which ones they are. All right, so I'm gonna move into our next haircut, which is kind of like a shorter kind of bowl haircut. So this one's gonna be a little bit different in that the goal is gonna be working in a lot of texture. And then you'll be able to sort of dry like smooth and straight, or you can dry with like a little bit more of like a curly type of a fringe element. But No doubt about it, it's definitely a bowl cut, which is super awesome. I find that they're like, if you soften them up enough, you give them kind of like a pixie sort of an element to it, which people are really, really into. But it gives you just a little bit more length throughout the top than, like what a pixie would allow for you. So I'm actually going to approach this a little bit more scissor over comb throughout the sides. So, when choosing where I like to isolate, the top from the sides, a lot of the times I'll use sort of just the recession to separate top of a person's head from the sides and the back. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to work, like a horizontal, and it's going to get slightly more diagonal, and it's going to dip down into the crown. And the reason that I do it that way is because here in this part of the haircut, I'm going to transition from scissor over comb into like a graduation, because I need to be able to build enough length to connect into the bowl part that's going to sit throughout the top. So what I want to do is I'm just going to isolate everything throughout the top. Okay, just like that. I'm going to work a scissor over comb throughout the sides and the back. But I want to create a super soft edge into the hair throughout the sides. So I'm not going to come in here super blunt, because I don't want this to be all that clean. I actually want it to be a bit softer, so that it sort of like, from a aesthetic standpoint, flows into the softness that's going to be throughout the top. So, honestly, like I've seen some people kind of leave out the little bit throughout the sides and just in the nape, and then refine some of that out a little bit later if they want to. I think that that's always a really cool look, and it just kind of gives you like a little bit more of a softer sort of finish. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to point into the scissor over comb. Okay, so I'm just going to create like this really soft edge, and then I can come in here and just sort of like with the razor carve that out a little bit more afterwards. I'm not too worried about it right now. What I really want to do is just sort of establish the length throughout the sides and the back. And I find that pointing into it, it just gives me a little bit of a softer finish than compared to coming in blunt or coming in here with like a clipper or something like that. So moving into the back, and I think that like pointing into a scissor over comb, especially if like, maybe you don't do a whole ton of it as a technique, and maybe like you're a little bit worried about cutting too short. Scissor over comb for some people, especially if they've never done it before, it can be a bit of an intimidating kind of technique to use. But if you want to create a soft perimeter and you don't want to use a clipper because it's not really going to get you the softest, pointing as opposed to cutting blunt is a really good introduction into scissor over comb, because it's going to give you like a softer finish anyways. You know what I mean? So it builds in just like a tiny little bit of like a security compared to coming in here like super blunt with a scissor over comb. So I'm just going in here and pointing this out, and then when I'm finished, I'm going to take my razor and just sort of soften the pieces that I left long, right? So this stuff and that stuff there. So I'm going to come in here with my razor. And right now, I don't have anything in the hair just yet because I'm only working throughout the sides. So I'm going to come in here and just sort of like soften that up. Okay, and just sort of soften that, and then, I can work a little bit of like, like a curl cream or something in there just to sort of bring that out a little bit more. But I think I'm going to stop there because I can always do a little bit more later. I'm going to work a little bit more throughout the sides here, for the back. Alright, so there I go there. Now I'm going to move into, let's see, the other side. All right, so I'm isolating that, and I want to make sure that before I move any further, that I'm symmetrical on both sides. So I'm going to come through here and just make sure that I got the same amount of buildup on both sides of the head. Only because, you know, you want to make sure, especially when you're getting into a shorter length like this, that it's as on purpose as it could possibly be, because I find that one of the reasons why, you know, a lot of people are nervous to work with shorter lengths is because they can be less forgiving. Like the margin of error is so much smaller when you're working in a shorter length of hair that you can't hide it with, like, you know, a curling iron or a round brush. It just kind of is what it is. So it's super important that, like, all of my division lines where I parted everything off is as symmetrical as possible, so that things just come out a little bit more balanced. So now that I've got this side down, I'm going to go ahead and work into the other side. Again, the same concept, you know, just scissor over comb. I'm going to leave a little bit of length right over the ear out. You know what? Let me move this that way everybody can see there. That should be easier for you. Alright, so I'm going to finish throughout this side here, and then I'm just going to check my balance from side to side to make sure that I'm nice and even. Because again, like I said, symmetry is super important when I'm working this type of a shape. So I've got this part here, I've got this part in the back, so it should be pretty easy for me to come through and connect those together now. And again, like I said, you know, the goal of this whole shape is just like as soft as possible. So I feel like it's a really, really good introduction into something a little bit more, I don't know, advanced of a technique like a true scissor over comb, where you're really just working like a super blunt and defined perimeter. This is going to be a good way to sort of introduce yourself into the technique if it's not something you're comfortable working in. But once I'm finished, I'm going to come through the front. I'm going to make sure that my two sides are as balanced as possible. I'm going to take the rest of the hair and just kind of clip this up. Alright, so basically I'm just kind of taking this hair and I'm a little bit shorter in this, or I want to be a little bit shorter in this spot right here, so I'm going to go in there and do that, but throughout the back I feel pretty good. So once I'm finished with that, then I'm going to come throughout the sides and I'm going to take some of the length out of that part there. Alright, so once I'm finished with that, I'm going to come throughout the back with the razor. Alright, so now what's going to happen as soon as I'm finished with this is I'm going to come in through the crown here, right in the back, and I've got to start to blend my graduation up from the back here. I'm going to build it up into the crown. So here I'm ending at this length here, and what's going to happen is I'm going to use my finger angles to create more length right there in the crown, and it's that length that I'm going to use to then create the bowl throughout the front. Okay, so I'm going to transition into a smaller shear, and I'm going to separate right at sort of the apex, right? I'm just going to do a cross section from behind the ear through the apex to the ear on the other side, okay? And so I'm just taking a section, I'm separating the front of the head from the back of the head. Okay, and if I'm starting to feel a little bit too dry, then I'm just going to take a little spray bottle and saturate, right? So I'm going to come in here and check questions really quick. Let's see. Okay, can't see how much you're taking off, how much you're removing. I would say that by the time I was finished, what I've got left is maybe an inch on both sides throughout the front. And I would say probably about an inch throughout the back too. Now, if you want something cleaner, just go shorter. If you want something softer, go a little bit longer, but be careful not to go too long, as that what you're trying to do is to accentuate the length that we're going to leave throughout the top. So once you start to get a bit too long, then it ends up looking more like I don't know, like a moppy type of a haircut, which isn't a bad thing. Obviously, more length means you can do more with the style. So, you know, it's customizable, but I would say that if you're going for cleanliness, shorter. If you're going to accentuate the length on the top, shorter. You know, I'm kind of choosing more of an inch only because I wanted that balance between like slimming, you know what I mean, and accentuating the top, but not so short to where like, you know, you really can't do anything with like the little wisps throughout the side or anything like that. So about an inch, yeah, and then I went over the ear, so it was really kind of like recession line, right back to the crown, and then dip just down a little bit into the low crown, just so that you got a bit of length throughout the top, okay? And then, yeah, awesome, thank you. So now I've created a division line right across, like a cross section from behind the ear through the apex to the ear on the other side, so you got this guy here just like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the center back, and I'm going to work like a pivoting section all the way around to the other side. Okay, pivoting section all the way around to the other side. And I'm going to build a bit of graduation. So I'm going to start, let's see, just like that. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to grab the top part of the scissor over comb that I created for myself. And I'm going to angle my fingers so that I'm building out weight. So the stuff that comes from the very top is going to be longer, and the stuff that comes from the bottom is just going to blend those two together, okay? So what I want to do is, again, in keeping the kind of like soft theme, I'm just going to point into all of this. Now, you could come in here and cut this blunt, but I find that, you know, if you start at the very bottom soft, right, by pointing into your scissor over comb, and I transition it into the top with more structure, it sometimes doesn't translate as well. So just to kind of save you that little bit of a problem, just going from soft into soft is probably the best way to go. And I find, again, just like I said, in keeping with more of like that kind of textured theme, pointing into everything just sort of like softens the blow just a little bit more. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to comb everything out, and I'm going to work, again, in a pivoting manner, using my previous section as the guide for my next section. So the first section I'm using as my guide for the next, and then I'm going to separate my first, get rid of that one. So now I've got only my second section there. I'm going to take my third, so now I got just my second and my third. I'm going to bring those together, okay? And you can see that the further out I get, the more that I start to disconnect myself from the length throughout the sides, okay? And that's just because, like, as I start to move outwards, if I'm using the guide from the previous section, then as I start to move away, it's going to get longer and longer and farther away from the length throughout the sides. But that's what I want, because I want for the bowl to kind of sit on top of the weight that I removed. And that's just going to make it so that it's a little bit slimmer, okay? So I take my next section, you can see that my guide is right there, okay? And so I'm going to come in through here, and I'm just going to point that out. Okay, and then I'm going to get rid of my second section. Now I just have my third and my fourth. So I'm going to come in here now and bring those two together. So I'm really just sort of like pivoting around the head. Nothing is going like straight back. It's all just kind of coming straight out from where it lives. And I'm finding my guide by combining my previous section and my current one. So now you can see that by the time I get out to the side, this length no longer connects with the sides, and it falls, and it's going to sit right around kind of like the earlobe area if you did the same length as I. If you went shorter than myself, it'll sit a little bit higher up. If you did it longer, it's going to sit a little bit lower. So it's really kind of customizable, right? So when I comb that down over the bottom, you can see that this stuff now starts to cover up the sides, where in the back it blends, so it goes from blending into a little bit longer. And then this length I'm going to use to create my bowl right across the front there. All right. So before I do that, I'm going to come around to the other side. I'm going to do the same thing. Okay. So I'm going to take a section. I'm going to use my very center section as my guide. Here, let me just sort of move really fast. That way you guys can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Okay, so I isolate my previous section and just my current section. Okay, and then isolate, pull all this straight out. Okay, and there's my guide there. And what I want to do before I move any further is I just want to check my balance and make sure that I'm the same on both sides. And you know, I like to get into the habit of doing stuff like that simply because the more often I do it, the less that I'm going to have to adjust anything afterwards. So that's a tiny bit longer on this side here. So I'm just going to adjust that very bottom part there, and then I should be good. Awesome. Okay. So now you end up with just a shape that looks like that, right? This is starting to fall over the top, blends in the back, falls over the top on that side, kind of sits right about that length there, okay? So now that I'm finished with that, I'm going to let the whole top part down. And I'm going to spray a little bit of water into it because I'm going to move into the front, but I'm going to use my razor. And I want to use the razor because I want it to be really, really soft around the edges in the front. So I want to make sure I get a pretty good amount of saturation. Okay, and then I'm going to comb. And what I want to do is I just to make this easy, I'm going to part this down the center. That way I have the same amount on both sides. Okay, so I'm going to make this about as centered as I can here. Alright, so once I've got that down and taken care of, basically what I'm doing is I'm taking horizontal sections, I'm going to comb everything down, and I'm going to use the guide from behind the ear to connect into the front, okay? So I've got my razor, and what I want to do is I want to put just a little bit of lift into the shape too. So from the front, it's going to be lifted out just a tiny little bit like that, and that's just to create a bit of a softer finish. It's going to bevel a little bit more, okay? Because I'm changing this from like a one length, if I'm pulling it straight down, into a soft graduation by lifting it up. So I'm going to lift this up a tiny little bit, okay? And then I'm basically just going to use the tip of the razor to sort of draw that line horizontally across to the front. Okay, and then once I'm finished, and you guys can see like the end result is going to be, you know, kind of piecey, choppy. You might end up with a little bit more length here and there, which I go through and just refine a little bit more. But, you know, you basically want that to sit as straight. It's not going to be as straight as if you're using a scissor. If you want that to be blunt and clean, then I would say go ahead and use a shear. But I want for this to just be as like soft and as airy as I possibly can. So, let's see. Question: dealing with high hairlines? Oh yeah. So, I'm assuming you're talking about like a bit more of a recession. If I'm dealing with like a little bit more of a recession, and the hairline just kind of jumps up a little bit higher, you then just have to make sure that you have as much density throughout the top to sort of make up for that. Otherwise, the front, like the fringe or whatever, it can end up looking too weak. So to answer that question, I'm going to go up in here after I'm done with this, and I'm going to layer across the top because I want to make this a little bit lighter and airier. If I were doing it on somebody with a high hairline and I'm worried about the perimeter of the bowl cut looking too like thin, I just won't layer on the top. I'll just leave it, a little bit closer to like this graduation I'm doing here, because the more hair that meets the perimeter, the fuller and the thicker it's going to look. So I would just skip the last step of this haircut and not layer into the top. And if you're worried about like texture, like, oh, well, I like the look of a layer, but I still am kind of worried about cutting too much off, then maybe instead of layering, just go into the very ends with a texturizing scissor or a texturizer or something like that, so that you can keep the thickness and the density without the layer, but you give the texture. So that's what I would probably do. Yeah, it's a disconnect on the side. So this little stuff right here, I left just to see like when I'm finished if I like it. If not, I'll end up taking it off. But sometimes when I'm working with shorter hair, as long as I've got the blessing of like my client, I'll leave little stuff like that to customize later, just in case we decide like it fits with the aesthetic a bit more. But unless somebody is like hard no, like not into it, I usually won't leave stuff like that. But if you have the option to customize and introduce something different to clients, like I try to find little opportunities to do that, just so people don't get bored with me. You know what I mean? Because I like I said, I work full time behind the chair. I'm behind the chair, 5, sometimes 6 days a week. You guys know how it is. And you know what I mean? Like I have no delusions about my skill and my abilities as a hairdresser. Like I know that there's hairdressers everywhere, especially in Chicago. We're all over the place. So if I can just find tiny opportunities to offer and to do something different for my client than maybe what's been offered to them before, then I look at that as like an opportunity to sort of like, like solidify my place as their professional, or the person that they go to for things like that. So I don't know, I'm constantly trying to think about ways to sort of make myself more necessary. Do you know what I mean? So once I'm finished, I end up with like these really soft sort of pieces, which I like. Like I like the softness in that, so I'm gonna leave that. If you don't like it, then you just cap all that stuff off afterwards. But now that I'm finished with that, I'm gonna move over to the other side, and I'm gonna do the same thing. Now, before I started in the front, I made sure that those two division lines were the same, right? Because if they're not, you're gonna end up with a crooked bowl here. So you really want to make sure that those are as close to even as possible. And then once I feel pretty good about that, then again, I'm going to place a little bit of lift, and I'm basically going to go across this side, same thing, right? So I'm going to go across this side. All right. All right, once I bring all that down, again, same thing. All right, and then I got tiny little pieces here, which I'm into. I might come here and refine just a few more of them out. But now that I'm done, right, I got all this length across the front that you can, style in a versatile way. So because it comes straight across the front and straight into the front, you're going to end up with the most length around the outside edges, which is great because if I decide I want to style over this side, it falls short to long to this side. And if I decide that, your client wants to style that way, then it's going to fall short to long to a point on that side. And so you got, some customization there. If you want, you can take off the very little edge down at the bottom there. But I find that having that length sometimes just gives you a little bit more of like an option in terms of styling. So again, like I said, I'm going to come across the top and I'm just going to take a tiny little bit of weight off just so that it's not so heavy like down at the perimeter there. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to come across horizontally across the top here, okay? And I'm going to start in the apex. I'm going to bring all this up, and you should see the hair come to a point. and that's because it was parted down the center and both sides had to come all the way down to the bottom. So what I want to do is I want to take that point off. So I'm going to come in here and I'm basically just sort of like pointing out the very tip of that, right, the very point of that section. And what that does is it's just going to soften up the amount of hair that lives on the perimeter. Now, that question that I got a little bit earlier about, what would I do for somebody with, a pretty high hairline, if I'm really worried about the density at the perimeter of this particular part of the haircut, then I'd skip this step pretty much. If I still want texture into the hair, then I skip this step, but maybe I go through the ends with like a texturizing scissor or a texturizer or something like that. And then that's pretty much it. So this comes up, I go through, I point out some of the weight throughout the top here, and then I'm finished, right? So now I get into the styling. All right. So basically, I like to work in, here what I'm going to do is I'm going to work in a little bit of liquid rollers, which is again like, it's a curl balm, okay? So it's a curl balm, and I'm going to mix into it a little bit of Shape Vixen, which is a volumizing lotion, okay? And I love using these two products together because they just give me like a little bit more of like a lighter, sort of fluffier. Like liquid rollers as a product is a bit softer to the touch compared to like a Total Recoil. And so it does like a better job, I think, of just getting like a light, fluffy airiness out of it, which is cool if you're going for like that really, really soft, sort of ethereal, you know what I mean, like pixie type of, soft type of a look, especially if you've got some wave into the hair. And so I find that like coming in here and just sort of like bending out some of the ends and kind of molding and shaping the fringe so that you got a bit more of like a kick to either side is like something that you can do. With those two products together. Shape Vixen is a volumizing lotion, so what that's going to do is that's going to help to sort of beef up the individual hair strands and kind of create like a finish into the hair that is, just like fluffier and lighter. It's not heavy in any kind of a way, which is one of the reasons why I like to use it, especially if I'm working with like a finer hair texture. So I'm just coming in here and, my method is exactly the same as it was for the last haircut. Like what I like to do is I try to get the hair, while it's wet, looking as much like the finished or the finished shape as I want it to, right? While it's wet, so I try to make it look as much like the finished shape as possible while the hair is wet, because my goal from this point is like not to touch it at all until a shell has formed around the hair. And like shell, the whole thing about the shell, the whole concept about the shell is that it's going to form even if it's just water in the hair, right? Like try to think back to beauty school, as painful as that is, right? Try to think back to beauty school. Like I remember there was a time where I would put rollers in my doll heads and I would just stick them under the dryer. It's just water, like no product in whatsoever. And when it comes out of the dryer, it's like crispy and it's hard. And that is those salt bombs and those hydrogen bombs forming back together and solidifying, right? So if you have product into the hair now, that's just going to make that bond even stronger. And so that's why I like using things like, liquid rollers and Total Recoils and Shape Vixens and you know what I mean, like MacGyver as like a styling foam. Like that's why I like using products into the hair, drying it, not touching it until the shell forms. Once it's kind of hard and crispy to the touch, then I scrunch it out until it's like nice and soft, and then I'll use like a finishing product like a haze or a shebang bang or something like that to sort of give it like a little bit more shape and style. But basically, yeah, so that would be kind of like the finished look, you know what I mean, is just sort of like shaping it to how I want it to look, and then just sort of like either diffusing or letting my clients sit under the dryer until I got that, that nice strong shape, and then I can go through and sort of like refine it. Like once it's dry, then I would go through with my shear and sort of like, or my razor, and like, get rid of the length around the ears or get rid of the length at the nape, or like if I want to make a piece here shorter, I would go about doing that after then the shape is dry, because there's all kinds of ways that you can sort of like customize and detail and refine. But that's pretty much my look right there. So I think with both, the goal is really just sort of like, there were no blunt edges used, right? Like I didn't cut anything blunt with the shears or the razor. Like the goal is really just try to create as much of a peak in the valley in the sections and in the perimeters as you possibly can, because I feel like they're better suited to hair that's just got a little bit more movement to it. You know, I'm definitely a fan of working with strong lines when I'm working with straighter hair or like more of a wave, or if I'm gonna flat iron or blow something out really smooth. But anytime I'm working with any kind of texture into the hair, I'm usually building in a little bit of negative space via a point cut or using a razor or a texturizer or something like that. But yeah, again, you know, I really just kind of wanted to thank you guys for popping in and kind of hanging out with me for an hour and a half. If anybody has any questions about anything hair related or Evo products or techniques or anything like that, you can find me at Christian Awesome on Instagram. I'm super good about reading my messages and getting back. But again, I want to thank everybody for your time and just enjoy the rest of your day. All right, thank you.